The pre-dawn light of June 6, 1944, is a bruised purple filtered through a thick haze of diesel exhaust and the stinging spray of the English Channel. Inside the pitching, grease-slicked belly of LCT 592, the air is suffocating. The men of the 70th Tank Battalion are no longer soldiers, they are passengers in a steel cavern, braced against the rhythmic, bone-jarring slam of the Atlantic against the bow ramp. Every few seconds, a wave crests over the side, dousing the M4 Shermans. These are not ordinary tanks. They are duplex-drive variants, fitted with collapsible canvas flotation screens that make the 30-ton war machines look like absurd, oversized bathtubs. The men joked with grim irony, calling them Eskimo kayaks. The tension is a physical weight, heavier than the grease-stained coveralls they wear. They know the math. Only a few inches of rubberized canvas stand between them and the crushing weight of the sea. At 06:14 hours, the world dissolves into a cacophony of mechanical violence. The ramp of the landing craft drops with a deafening metallic clang that reverberates through the hull like a funeral bell. Beyond the ramp lies a churning wasteland of grey water and the distant flickering orange stabs of German shore batteries. The order is given. The first Sherman, Tank A-16, roars to life, its engine a guttural scream in the confined space. It rolls forward, dipping its nose into the swell. For a heartbeat, the tank vanishes beneath the foam, and then, miraculously, the canvas screen holds. The propellers kick in, churning the salt water into a white froth. The crew sits low in the water, peering through periscopes at a horizon dominated by the smoke of a naval bombardment so intense the vibrations can be felt through the soles of their boots. They are floating in a 10-ton steel coffin, miles from the shore of Utah Beach, moving through a fog of war that is literal, cold and wet. One tear in the fabric, one stray piece of shrapnel, and the Atlantic will claim them before the Germans even have a chance. As the sound of the churning surf reaches a crescendo, the scene suddenly pulls back. The roar of the 14-inch naval guns fades into the heavy, humid silence of a Maryland summer 4 years earlier. But to understand how these men found themselves floating in the dark, we must look back to the desperate origins of the unit. The year is 1940. The world is reeling from the catastrophic fall of France, a collapse so swift and brutal it has shattered every existing American military assumption about armored warfare. Out of this desperate urgency, the 70th Tank Battalion is born at Fort Meade. It is not formed as a legendary spearhead, but as a raw, experimental testing ground. The men who arrive are the guinea pigs of a doctrine that has not even been written yet. Their equipment is a joke that no one is laughing at. They are issued the M2A2 light tank. These Mae Wests, with their twin, independent turrets, are relics of a bygone era. They are more akin to armoured tractors than modern weapons. They are cramped, underpowered and protected by armour so thin that a heavy machine gun could pierce it like parchment. The soldiers, many of whom had lived through the country club atmosphere of peacetime service, find themselves thrust into a chaotic scramble for identity. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Stephen G. Henry, the 70th becomes a laboratory for survival. They are tasked with bridging the impossible gap between theoretical infantry support and the terrifying new reality of independent tactical maneuver. There are no manuals for what they are being asked to do. They spend their days in the dust of training fields, practicing amphibious landings with wooden mock-ups. They learn to coordinate with infantry through sheer trial and error. The command structure is a confusing web of shifting priorities. The materiel shortages are so severe that crews often have to imagine they are firing shells they do not actually possess. They are a battalion in name, but in reality, they are a collection of technician-grade improvisers. They are fighting a war of logistics and theory long before they ever see a German uniform. This is the crucible where the flexible, independent tank battalion is forged. It did not happen in the glory of a charge, but in the frustrating, mundane struggle to turn obsolete scrap metal into a force capable of surviving the lethal complexities of the modern battlefield. By the autumn of 1942, the theoretical games of Fort Meade dissolved into the biting reality of the North African coast. The transition was a violent jolt to the system. The soldiers who had once enjoyed the comforts of stateside barracks now found themselves shivering in the Thameson Mountains. The air was a biting cocktail of high winds, freezing rain, and unexpected snow. They were no longer testing doctrine, they were living it. The battalion had traded their obsolete tanks for the M3 and M5 light tanks. These were machines that felt like spaceships by comparison. These new Stuarts featured Cadillac V8 engines that hummed with a deceptive smoothness. They carried revolutionary gun stabilizers that promised the impossible, the ability to fire accurately while on the move. Yet, as they pushed into the desert, the technical magic of the machines was often overshadowed by the biological misery of the men. The soldiers were gripped by a constant, debilitating nausea. This was a side effect of the yellow attabrin tablets they swallowed to stave off malaria. They lived in the pervasive, cloying scent of diesel fuel and unwashed wool. The baptism by fire for the 70th at the port of Safi was a symphony of sensory overload. The nighttime landing was defined by a tension so thick it seemed to muffle the sound of the waves. Then, the silence was obliterated by the USS New York. The 14-inch naval guns fired with a concussion that rattled the teeth of every man in the landing craft. The muzzle flashes briefly turned the night into a blinding, white noon as they vaporized a French-held fort. But the true test of the battalion's maturing tactical soul came later, amidst the jagged ridges near Pichon. Could a handful of light tanks hold off a concentrated enemy force? It was here that Lieutenant Colonel Stephen G. Henry orchestrated a cinematic ruse that would become legend. This was the Pichon deception. With only 15 light tanks at his disposal, Henry ordered a continuous rhythmic loop. The tanks ground through the winding mountain passes and disappeared behind a ridge. Then they circled back to reappear again and again in a dusty, metallic procession. To the German observers peering through binoculars from the distant heights, the spectacle suggested something impossible. They did not see a lone battalion. They saw the arrival of a massive, unstoppable armored division. This psychological phantom held the line. The American tankers stalled the enemy through sheer theatricality and the deafening roar of engines echoing off the canyon walls. They had learned that on the modern battlefield, the appearance of power could be just as lethal as the power itself. But the theatre of the Pichon deception was merely a mask for a terrifying reality that finally shattered during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. The battalion was riding high on the confidence of their light tanks until they hit a terminal wall at a dust-choked roadblock near Barrafranca. The sun beat down like a hammer, while the air hung heavy with the smell of scorched earth and dry wheat. As the lead elements rounded a bend, the horizon was suddenly dominated by the angular, predatory silhouettes of German Panzer IVs. The engagement was instantaneous and catastrophic. American crews watched in horror as their 37mm armor-piercing shells struck the German steel and ricocheted into the sky like glowing sparks. The rounds, they were told, could win the war, left nothing but shallow silver gouges on the enemy armor. The German tanks responded with long-range 75mm fire that tore through the light American armor as if it were made of tin. In a screaming chaos of whistling steel and erupting fuel, the mission of the battalion shifted forever. The realization was a cold blade to the gut. Light tanks could no longer lead the charge. The men were forced into a desperate counterattack from the high ground, using the terrain just to stay alive, while their commanders frantically pivoted toward the heavier Sherman tanks. This was more than a battle. It was the death of an entire military doctrine. By the time the battalion was pulled back to the camps of England to prepare for the invasion of France, the atmosphere had changed. The amateur enthusiasm of 1940 was gone, replaced by a grim and professional secrecy. The men lived under the shadow of the highest security clearances, hunkering down in salvaged huts and sharing their quarters with a turtle mascot named Joe Peckerwood. But the tension of the coming Great Crusade found its most lethal expression not on the beaches of Normandy, but during a dress rehearsal known as Exercise Tiger. On the moonless night of April 28, 1944, the landing craft were wallowing in the English Channel off Slapton Sands. Suddenly, the fog of war turned lethal. German torpedo boats streaked out of the darkness and into the convoy, launching a spread of torpedoes that turned the channel into a graveyard of burning oil and screaming men. There was no room for heroics, because the ships were under strict orders not to stop for men overboard. The tankers watched from the decks as their comrades vanished into the black, frigid water. The silence of the night was punctuated only by the low hiss of sinking steel. 639 men were lost in a matter of minutes. This was the final, brutal lesson before D-Day. The men now understood the technical fragility of their equipment, the unpredictability of the sea, and the sheer, indiscriminate nature of the violence they were about to inherit. The battalion was no longer a testing ground. They were a scarred, cynical, and highly specialized force waiting for the ramp to drop on a world that was already burning. The exhilaration of the breakout across France was a fever dream of speed that nearly vibrated the battalion to pieces. For a few frantic weeks, the war felt won as the Shermans outran their own maps. The hedgerows of Normandy blurred into the open plains of the interior, but beneath the triumphalist roar of the engines, the machine was disintegrating. The battalion had become a nomadic tribe of scavengers. In the grease-slicked darkness of a roadside repair pit, men like Sergeant Francis Ross didn't see the glory of liberation. They saw the catastrophic thinning of a gasket, or the jagged shearing of a metal wheel. The supply lines were stretched to a snapping point, hundreds of miles behind the clattering treads. Maintenance became a dark art of diplomacy fueled by alcohol. Ross and his mechanics moved through the chaos with captured crates of French cognac and German schnapps, bartering liquid courage for the only thing that mattered. They traded for spare starter motors or a few precious treads. The air in these improvised workshops was a choking haze of blue exhaust and the rhythmic metallic clink of hammers against steel. It was a desperate percussion played against the clock as the tanks pushed deeper into the land of the dead. This transition into the heart of Normandy was a descent into a claustrophobic earthen purgatory known as the bocage. The maps showed open fields, but the reality was a labyrinth of ancient sun-blotted hedgerows. These were mounds of earth and tangled roots 6 feet thick, topped by impenetrable hawthorn and oak. It was a landscape perfectly designed for an ambush. The smell hit the tankers before the enemy did. It was a cloying, sweet and sour stench of thousands of bloated, rotting cattle lying in the fields. Their legs were stiff and pointing toward a sky choked with the smoke of burning villages. In this green nightmare, the Sherman tank was a clumsy and vulnerable giant. A single German defender could wait in the absolute silence of a hedgerow until the thin underbelly of a tank was exposed as it tried to climb the embankment. Then he would fire an anti-tank rocket at point-blank range. The solution was forged in fire and scrap metal. Sergeant Curtis Cullen watched this mechanical futility and began a frantic improvisational surgery on the armor. He used the jagged steel teeth salvaged from the twisted wreckage of German beach obstacles. Cullen and his team spent 48 hours straight in a shower of white-hot welding sparks. They birthed the Rhino tank, a Sherman fitted with a massive, four-pronged steel cutter on its nose. The first time a modified tank struck a hedgerow, the sensation was transformative. Inside the turret, the crew felt the engine groan with a guttural, low-frequency vibration that rattled their teeth. The 500-horsepower engine roared as the steel teeth bit deep into the ancient roots. Instead of climbing and exposing its belly, the 30-ton tank simply tore through the embankment. A shower of black dirt and shredded wood rained down on the commander as the tank burst into the next field. The steel tusks dripped with mud and debris. This was no longer a tactical maneuver. It was industrial-scale excavation. Yet, even with this technical edge, the land of the dead exacted a toll that the official records could never capture. The dry reports of 16 tanks lost could not describe the sensory overload of the road to St. Lo. The battalion moved through a wasteland where the very birds had been silenced by the relentless 88mm barrages. At night, the tankers were hypnotized by the tiny, slit-like driving lights of the vehicle ahead. They moved through a pitch-black void where the only other light was the flickering orange glow of a burning tank on the horizon. They passed the charred skeleton of a tank at a place they called Dead Man's Corner. The metal was still pinging as it cooled in the damp night air. The soldiers lived in a state of total exhaustion, their eyes sunken and rimmed with red dust. Their ears rang with the constant, concussive crump of incoming mortar fire. They were no longer the boys who had trained in the Maryland countryside. They were the hardened, cynical core of a force that had learned to navigate the fog of war through the scent of explosives, the heat of a welding torch, and the grim necessity of tearing the very earth apart to survive. The adrenaline of the breakout through France died in the freezing, oxygen-starved mud of the German border. By November 1944, the 70th Tank Battalion had transitioned from a high-speed dash into a grinding, attritional nightmare where the maps no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the next 50 yards of saturated earth. The Huertgen forest was not a battlefield. It was a vertical tomb of ancient pines and slate-grey fog. The tankers, once masters of open maneuver, found themselves confined to narrow logging trails that had been churned into a grey slurry the consistency of wet cement. The tanks did not drive. They wallowed, their engines screaming in low gear as they fought the suction of the mud. To move at all, the crews were forced into a desperate mechanical symbiosis. They used heavy steel tow chains to link 3 or 4 Shermans together, creating a clanking iron caterpillar straining to crest a single icy ridge. Inside the turrets, the air was a foul cocktail of unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of the radio humming in the corner, and a pervasive chilling damp. That dampness turned every piece of steel into a heat sink, leaching the life from the limbs of the men. The true terror of the forest was the tree burst. In the open fields of Sicily or North Africa, a high-explosive shell cratered the earth. But here, the German 88mm guns aimed for the canopy. When a shell struck the thick upper branches of the pines, it turned the trees themselves into weapons. A lethal rain of jagged steel shrapnel and white-hot wood splinters shredded everything below. Some of those splinters were the size of bayonets. The tankers, who usually relied on their hatches for a sliver of visibility, were forced to button up in total darkness. They peered through salt-filmed periscopes as the forest canopy disintegrated above them. The sound was a relentless, concussive crack boom that echoed through the ravines until it became a single, vibrating roar. The battalion was operating at a breaking point. The supply lines had withered to a thread, leaving tanks to go into action with only 2-man crews. Cooks, clerks, and mechanics were pulled from the rear and shoved into the bow-gunner seats. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide behind grease-smeared goggles as they learned the lethal geometry of armoured warfare on the fly. As the winter of 1944 deepened, the 70th evolved from a support unit into a specialised fire brigade. They became a mobile force of brute force engineers, tasked with cracking the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line. The pivot back to aggression was led by a specialised task force, but the spearhead was a terrifying new adaptation, the flamethrower tank. At the approach to a massive concrete bunker, the atmosphere changed from the cold damp of the forest to a searing industrial heat. The crew of the specialized Sherman watched through the narrow slits of their vision blocks as the American infantry pinned the German defenders with a relentless carpet of machine gun fire. The tank lurched forward, its turret traversing with a hydraulic whine until the long, blackened nozzle of the flame gun was leveled at the target. Then came the whoosh. It was a sound less like an engine and more like the intake of a giant's breath. A high-pressure stream of thickened gasoline erupted from the tank. It was a roiling orange and black serpent that arced through the air for 70 yards. When the liquid fire struck the concrete, it did not just burn, it licked into the ventilation shafts and gun ports, consuming the oxygen in a heartbeat. The tankers felt the heat through the 3-inch armor plate. It was a physical weight that made the sweat pour down their backs under their heavy wool coats. The sight was hypnotic and horrific. The bunker, once a symbol of German permanence, was suddenly wreathed in a hellish, pulsating glow. This was the new face of the war. It was no longer a matter of tactical finesse or clever deceptions. It was a grim, mechanical process of incineration and extraction. By the time the battalion pushed toward the Rhine, the fog of war had become a literal, blinding wall. On the morning of December 18th, the Ardennes offensive plunged the 70th into a sensory void. The tankers could see no further than the ends of their own gun tubes. They relied on the crackle of their radios, where voices were strained and distorted by distance and fear. They coordinated fragmented defences around small villages, holding the line against the unknown. At night, they used their tank searchlights to cast long, eerie shadows against the low clouds. They created a flicker that signaled their positions to the shivering American infantry. They were a battalion of rusty relics and improvised task forces, holding the line with new 90mm Pershing tanks. These massive machines finally gave them the reach to punch through German steel at a distance. The transition was complete. From the raw, experimental light tanks of the training camps to the mud-caked, flame-spewing giants of the German border, the 70th Tank Battalion had become the indispensable scarred soul of the Allied advance. They had been forged in the green nightmare of the forest and tempered in the fires of the Siegfried Line. By the spring of 1945, the myth of the high-tech Nazi juggernaut had been ground into the black soil of the Rhineland. As the battalion surged into the German heartland, The tankers did not encounter a futuristic army. They found a medieval collapse. The Thousand-Year Reich was retreating on wooden wheels. The Americans, perched atop their mud-caked Shermans, rolled past miles of horse-drawn supply wagons. The air was thick with the smell of manure and the pathetic screaming of wounded draft animals. The enemy was no longer the elite Panzer Grenadier. Instead, they found terrified 14-year-old boys in oversized uniforms and old men with shaking hands clutching anti-tank rockets. This was the end game. It was a landscape of rusting, abandoned equipment and white bedsheets hanging from every window. The climax of this disintegration was captured in a strange, ritualistic surrender. A German colonel insisted on the scrupulous mechanical destruction of his own unit's equipment before he would formally submit. Only after the last radio was smashed and the last optics were shattered did the German surrender himself and 7,000 prisoners. That mass of humanity looked less like an army and more like a funeral procession for an ideology. Now we return to the churning grey water off Utah Beach, where the canvas screens of the landing craft are failing. This was the moment the entire history of the battalion had been leading toward. This was the focal point of the doctrine they had bled to perfect. As the ramp of the landing craft dropped into the freezing Atlantic, the fog of war became a physical weight. The landing sequence was a shambles. One tank company hit the surf before the others, a mistake that should have been fatal. But as the 30-ton tanks churned through the swells, the mechanical fragility of the mission was laid bare. Tank Alpha 16 vanished into the surf at 6:14 in the morning. It was a steel coffin claiming its crew in seconds as the sea motion overwhelmed the canvas. The landing craft itself became a charnel house, struck and sinking, claiming almost every man in a chaotic swirl of diesel and salt water. But the survivors dragged themselves onto the sand. The tanks that made it began to fire. In that moment of absolute chaos, the experimental guinea pigs of the armoured force became the shield of the invasion. The 70th Tank Battalion had arrived. They were improvised, they were adaptable, and they were ultimately unstoppable. For the men who managed to reach the sand, the chaotic mistake of the landing order became the salvation of the entire invasion. The tanks of Company Charlie clattered onto the wet grit of Utah Beach at 6:30 in the morning, arriving minutes before the first waves of infantry. In the traditional manual, a tank without infantry support is a sitting duck, but on D-Day, these lone Shermans became the only shield on the beach. As the German 88mm guns and machine guns opened up from the bluffs, the men of the 70th did not wait for orders. They moved directly into the surf line, their main guns barking at the concrete embrasures. They provided a wall of steel and fire that allowed the 4th Infantry Division to scramble ashore with remarkably light casualties compared to the slaughter at Omaha Beach. The specialized tanks had worked. The men who had survived the torpedoes of Exercise Tiger and the humiliations of training at Fort Meade were now the ones holding the door open for the liberation of a continent. This was the ultimate validation of the independent tank battalion. They were a versatile, improvised force that could survive the sinking of its own ships and still win the day through sheer, localized aggression. The journey of the 70th Tank Battalion ended not with a grand parade, but with a quiet and jarring contrast. If you look through the macro lens of the High Command, the 70th was just a line on a ledger. They were a spearhead that had traversed North Africa, Sicily, and France to help break the Siegfried Line. But if you look through the micro lens of the individual soldier, the legacy was etched in the mundane and the visceral. It was found in the wide-eyed stare of a man like Buck Isaacs, whose eyes had seen the charred remains of Tank No. 12 at Dead Man's Corner. It was found in the grease-stained hands of Francis Ross, who found more peace in the mechanical hum of a recovery engine than in the medals of a victor. As the battalion settled into the post-war atmosphere of Bamberg, occupying an old castle and converting a local school into barracks, the reality of their sacrifice was recorded in the files of the dead. Names like Walter T. Anderson and Aaron D. Curry represented the 29 men killed and the dozens missing in the green nightmare of the Huertgen forest. The 70th Tank Battalion was the American war machine in miniature. They were a raw, experimental unit, outfitted with obsolete scrap that evolved into an unstoppable force through the grit of technician-grade improvisers. They were men living in a world of mud and cordite. They had bridged the gap between the horse-drawn past and the mechanized future. As the veterans began the long process of rotating home, they left behind a trail of rusty relics and scorched earth. but they also left a blueprint for armored warfare that would define the next century. The final image of the 70th is not one of a high-tech titan. Instead, it is a single, weary tanker sitting in the quiet of a defeated Germany. He is cleaning the soot from his goggles and looking at a horizon that is finally, for the first time in 5 years, silent. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories for the generations to come. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.